You could be forgiven for thinking that hosting the world's climate conference in a petro-state boosting its oil and gas production has the makings of a satire. But here it is, COP29, Azerbaijan.
It's a gift of the God. Every natural resource, whether it's oil, gas, wind, sun, gold, silver, copper, all that are natural resources. Fake news media of the country, which is #1 oil and gas producer in the world and produces 30 times more oil than Azerbaijan, call us petrostate.
It takes place as the signals from nature itself and our scientists intensify that an irreversible warming point is upon us.
With the hottest day on record and the hottest months on record, this is almost certain to be the hottest year on record.
We are in a season of superlatives, and the reality is that these extreme weather events that the world is facing daily suggest that humanity and the planet are hurtling towards catastrophe.
While the rollout of clean energy is happening fast across the globe, the baseline figures are stark. According to the International Energy Agency, the share of fossil fuels in the global energy mix has come down from 82% in 2013 to 80% in 2023. But demand for energy has increased. We are, as the saying goes, running fast to stand still. Dark comedy is sometimes the only response.
You know how many the world is ending meetings we've had over the last 2 years?
Drought, famine.
Hole in the ozone is so boring.
And into this moment arrives the second Trump presidency, hurtling towards the climate conference like a comet.
It's all a big hoax. I just said, but Bobby, leave the oil to me. We have more liquid gold, oil and gas. We have more liquid gold than any country in the world. We will drill, baby, drill. We're going to drill, baby, drill. We don't have a global warming problem.
I spoke with Climate Change and Energy Minister Chris Bowen earlier. Chris Bowen, welcome to 7:30.
Great pleasure.
The PM says Donald Trump has promised a perfect friendship. Will you be able to use that perfect friendship to persuade Donald Trump not to withdraw from the Paris Agreement?
Well, I think the truth is, Sarah, that anybody who predicts US politics or geopolitical situations more broadly, based on the experience of the last 8 years, is taking a very brave punt.
But we know what Donald Trump thinks about climate change.
That's right. But in terms of our interactions, we will act guided by our national interest and our values. We'll be doing that bilaterally with the United States. I'll be doing it representing Australia at the COP, and that's the approach that we'll take across the board.
Is there any concern that Donald Trump could go further, not just pull out of the Paris Agreement, but pull out of the UN negotiating system altogether?
The UNFCCC, yes, that has been flagged. We don't know yet, and that would be of a different magnitude to last time. That is true.
Just to come back to that question, though, I mean, you're in the position at the moment, no matter how much work you put into this gruelling process that we'll talk about, as soon as the Trump presidency begins, you face that prospect that he will withdraw from Paris.
Well, I think just a few fundamental points, Sarah, about the United States. The election of a new president doesn't change some fundamentals, regardless of what approach he takes. The fundamentals that the world will continue to warm and we need to act. Point one. Point two, that the economics of renewable energy are so strong and it is our national interest to embrace that and to expand renewable energy. And point three, the United States is responsible for just a bit more than 10% of the world's emissions. So does that mean the rest of the 90% of us don't bother anymore, even if the US does withdraw action? No, it doesn't. That's not our approach, it won't be our approach, and it's not the approach of most international counterparts that I'm talking to.
But it represents a serious threat to tackling the problem, given the world's largest economy, the second largest polluter.
As I said, it's 10%, a bit more than 10% of the world's emissions. That's important, no question. The Albanese government and the Biden administration have been very closely aligned in policy and in personnel. But we respond to the circumstances as we see it, and we act in the national interest and according to our values. And at COPs and at other international forums, but the one I'm responsible for, the COP, we'll be continuing to argue for strong action across the board internationally and we're dealing with specific matters at this COP which need to be resolved so the world can move forward.
We'll just come to that in a minute, but are you concerned that with America, if America is going to walk away, as it says it will, that will have an effect on the ambitions of other countries? What will it mean for the Indians, for the Europeans?
Well, at this point, as I said, when I'm talking to international colleagues, no one is saying, well, let's give up. There are some people in each domestic debate who argue that. There are people in Australia who argue that, oh, Donald Trump's president, we don't need to worry about that anymore. That is fundamentally wrong.
Just excuse me for a moment, it's not a question of giving up or not giving up, it's the effect on a reduction in ambition,
Sure,
isn't it?
Sure, but even if a major power withdraws, that can be a time for middle powers to step up and to continue to argue for action. That's what I'll be doing, that's what Australia will be doing, and that's what middle powers like us, in my experience, like Germany and Canada and the United Kingdom, will be doing as well.
What does it mean for China if the United States does withdraw from the international system? Does that make China the world's leader in climate change?
Well, again, let's see how China responds. China will be putting forward a 2035 target at some time in the next few months. They are the world's largest emitter with a bit more than a third of emissions. They will be having an internal discussion about whether to take a strong role, a leadership role in emissions reduction or not. We'll see how that plays out in coming months.
And what about the Pacific? If China does emerge as the global climate leader, does that have implications for Australia and for the Pacific?
Well, in the Pacific, I work very, very closely with my Pacific ministerial counterparts, many of whom will be with me in the next week.
Who were relying on the United States?
Yeah, who and the Biden administration work closely with. Of course, we'll just continue to engage. We're bidding to host COP with them. We are working closely with them at this COP. And that is not only the right thing to do for them, and the very existence of some Pacific nations is what's at question here. It's also in our national interest in the geopolitical terms that you talk about.
Let me just ask you quickly about that question about whether or not Australia is going to win the right to host a COP. Do you expect to be successful on that?
Well, there's a process which is underway. We're getting very strong support, but there's no agreed ballot date or ballot process under the UNFCCC rules. I'm very pleased with the amount of support we're getting from international partners, but there's some way to go yet.
Now, you are co-chairing the most important discussion at this year's COP, that is the funds for developing nations to tackle climate change. In that particular regard, will countries contribute enough money if the United States is no longer there demanding stronger effort from around the globe?
Well, again, I mean, this is a hard task, Sarah. This is the new finance goal to replace the goal that was agreed at Paris. This would have been hard anyway with the geopolitical situation, Ukraine, Middle East, and it's a difficult question. We are facing questions about who contributes, what should be counted and what the total quantum should be. My job and the job of my co-chair, the Egyptian minister, is to try and guide the conversation, to try and reach consensus across 198 countries, which is never easy, as you can imagine. And I guess put the United States situation, add it to the list of challenges as we go. Does that mean we give up? No. Does it mean it becomes a little more complicated? Sure. But it's very important.
Will we see Australia's new emissions target before the election?
Well, I don't know when the election will be, Sarah. The Prime Minister might have told you, but he hasn't told me yet when he's planning on calling the election.
When are you planning on releasing the target? It's due in February, isn't it?
When the Climate Change Authority process, or the Climate Change Act process, I'll be abiding by the law. The Climate Change Act we instituted, made very clear, it's world's best practice, similar position to the United Kingdom and some others. I won't set a target until I've received advice from the Climate Change Authority, considered it, taken it to Cabinet, received the endorsement of the Cabinet. That's the process I'll follow.
So could Australia be late delivering its updated target?
Well, two countries have so far set their targets. The vast majority, 196, have not yet.
But it's due in February.
And countries talking about all sorts of timelines between now and the Brazil COP next year as to when they might lodge their target. I'll be complying with the Climate Change Act, and I'll be setting a target not a day earlier, not a day later than when I'm satisfied under that Act.
What's the interim advice on what that target should be?
I haven't received any interim advice.
None whatsoever? There's no... what are the debates around what kind of figures are you contemplating?
Well, I'm not going to preempt figures, but the target has to be ambitious and achievable. There's no point being one or the other. It's got to be both. It's got to stretch it's got to drive behaviour, stretch behaviour. It's also got to be achievable. Anybody can set a target, just nominate a figure. We'll be explaining how we can achieve that target when we do that. That's why it takes a while. This is not just, setting a number. Australia's approach, this government's approach, has been to outline not only a target, but to outline in quite a lot of detail how we intend to get there, and that's a key point.
Would you like to have that target in place before the election?
Well, I'd like to have it in place not a day earlier and not a day later than when I'm satisfied that it's the right approach for our role in the world, our economic best interest. The world's climate emergency is Australia's jobs opportunity in many ways, but we've got to calibrate it and get it 100% right.
Is climate change going to be a big issue at the election?
Yes, it's a big issue at every election. There'll be a stark choice. There's one side of politics which is getting on with the job. We've seen new figures out just this week showing us on track for 82% renewables, showing a big surge in investment. There's another side of politics which couldn't even tell you their 2030 target, let alone a 2035 target, and wants to pause all renewables while they wait for a nuclear fantasy to come on board. That's the clear and stark choice before the Australian people at the next election.
Just on politics, Peter Dutton said there is an eerie parallel, is the phrase he used, between the US election result and what's happening in Australia on cost of living. Have you got enough time to turn public opinion round on whether or not the Albanese government has done enough?
Australia's not the United States. Obviously, we all look at elections, whether it's United States, United Kingdom, and see what the patterns are and whether there's any teachings for us. But we're a different country, we're our own country. It'll be decided on our own issues on cost of living, whether it's stage 3 tax cuts, whether it's free TAFE, whether it's reducing HECS help debt. We have a very, very important story to tell. And we'll be taking all the time it needs to tell it.
But can you do that without a budget before an election?
Oh, well, that's entirely a matter for the Prime Minister. But whether there's another budget or not, we have a very important story to tell. Of course, there's always more to do. We're not complacent. But cost of living has been, I can tell you as a member of the Cabinet, the key focus of the Cabinet, and we've delivered a lot. And of course, we have a lot more to deliver and a lot more to talk about.
Just on another topic, were you surprised to see Tony Abbott come out in support of Kevin Rudd?
Oh, look, Kevin Rudd's doing a great job, and I think any serious person recognises that. Australia was prepared for this result, and that's in no small part due to Kevin Rudd's preparations. He has worked assiduously to prepare Australia, working with Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese and all of us, to prepare us for either result in the election. He has left nothing on the table. I think it's good that serious people on both sides of politics have recognised that. Not everyone in the Liberal Party has recognised that, but it's good that it has been recognised by some.
Chris Bowen, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah.
And now, Chief Political Correspondent Laura Tingle joins me. Laura, we just heard Chris Bowen say that there's going to be a stark choice at the election on climate change. Do both sides of politics want the issue?
They do and they don't, Sarah. I think the whole question about targets is sort of a bit 2019 or something. Clearly, both sides are sort of avoiding updating their 2030 and or 2035 targets. I think it's interesting that the coalition is sticking with net zero for 2050 because given the Trump victory, there's obviously pressure within the coalition to dump that.
It was a pretty hard slapdown, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it's been pretty comprehensive.
Yeah.
But having said that, where are the two sides going? Now, we heard Chris Bowen there talk about renewables and all those sorts of things. The coalition wants to talk about nuclear policy, except it doesn't actually want to tell us any details about it so far. And, you know, time is ticking away. So we've got two different discussions about climate. And Labor is framing it very much in the context of providing jobs up front for some of those communities, say in the Hunter Valley or the Latrobe Valley, places like that, which are transitioning from coal. So we're going to have two different discussions, but it's not going to be all of that stuff about international targets and things, despite the pressure from people like the Teals who are saying, you know, you guys have to say before the election what your targets will be, and it's an open question about whether we will see those or not.
But yeah, so that is an issue, given that the targets are due from all of the contributing countries in February. How does this government get away with not furnishing a target
It'd be pretty hard for them to get away with it, but I think even if they eventually furnish one, I think they want to be talking about those broader issues. And it's certainly true. I think we've seen that in the response around the world. You know, the sense that the sort of transition in the economy is now being led by China. It's being led by the private sector, and whatever Donald Trump does in the States, it's not great, but the momentum is there. elsewhere that things are happening, though it won't be as much if they're drilling and fracking at a great rate of knots.
Let's go to the Leader of the Opposition, because he gave an interview this morning that's interesting, because there were suggestions in there that they would not be offering tax cuts to high-income earners, as they had suggested earlier. What did you make of that?
I thought that was really interesting, Sarah. I mean, it's a reality check. So let's just remind viewers what happened. The Morrison government had these 3 stages of tax cuts. The first 2, which were offered while they were still in office, gave tax relief to lower-income earners. The stage 3 tax cuts were basically aimed at high-income earners. The Albanese government at the beginning of this year repurposed those and gave more cost of living relief via tax cuts to low and middle income earners and some to higher income earners. So the question was what you would do for those higher income earners. To do what the original stage 3 tax cuts were going to do would cost about $40 billion over 4 years, of which the money isn't there. So that's a pragmatic decision I think Peter Dutton has taken, but it does once again highlight the fact that the Coalition's original tax cuts wouldn't have benefited people. So it gives the Labor Party the opportunity to say, well, look, they hadn't actually originally intended to give you the money that we've given them.
Now, the opposition leader has been sharpening his lines, and there are some echoes from the Trump victory in those lines, but it's not an entirely safe space in Australia, is it?
Look, it's probably safer than maybe acceptable to some people. Without a doubt, the most obvious one is the lines about migration. Yes, migration is very high. Weaponising it is always dangerous. And it's been interesting that, for example, Peter Dutton leapt on the arrival of those 4 people on Croker Island to sort of say, well, the borders aren't safe. So that's all very Trumpian territory. But he has been there before, of course. But without a doubt, he has highlighted the fact that migration is going to be a front and centre issue for him. And the question will be the extent to which he's representing what's actually going on. We saw Bridget McKenzie talk a couple of days ago about how the consensus on migration has snapped. But the reality is that our migration policies and the fact that the majority of them migration is now something that just happens, it's demand driven, is something that both sides of politics have some culpability in if they don't like it. So, is the Coalition talking about changing it? We've already seen proposals to change university students coming in meet considerable resistance, and that's the easiest thing to change in the program.
Now, we said sharpening his lines, so how's the government been responding to those sharpened lines?
So a few things. First of all, he of course has been sort of suggesting the government's got something sneaky going on about election timing. The Prime Minister came out yesterday and said, well, if he thinks we're not being upfront, he's not upfront about anything. So they're putting a bit of pressure back on him. But without a doubt, they are increasing the pace of their own announcements. We are effectively in an election campaign, Sarah. So we've seen the HECS announcement. Today we saw an interesting announcement from Jim Chalmers about housing. And it sort of harks back to the Keating era in the sense that there are incentive payments, which he can sort of talk about as being productivity, incentive payments to get the states to slash red tape to speed up housing. So it's sort of got that economic, sensibility about it. And there's also been a foreshadowing from Jason Clare that they're going to do more on HECS debt. So they're really targeting those youth votes and trying to keep the message up that they're addressing the housing and cost of living issues. And to the extent that, I suppose it's interesting, Peter Dutton has so dominated and constructed and run the political agenda for most of this year, but they seem to be actually able to land a few things at the moment, so it's a bit more of an even airspace contest.
Even airspace contest. On that note, Laura, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Sarah.